Miss Marple and the Morning Milk Mystery. The first light of a spring morning glistened on dew-soaked hedgerows in St Mary Mead. A quiet breeze carried the scent of lilac, while milk bottles clinked gently on doorsteps, or at least they should have. But today, something was different, something no villager could have expected in their peaceful routines. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm truly happy you're here with us. It's wonderful how these mysteries connect us, no matter where we are in this big, wide world. If you'd like, write in the comments and let me know where you're listening from. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these gentle mysteries, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, pour yourself a comforting cup of tea or coffee, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Bottles at Dawn. The first light of dawn crept through the lace curtains of Danemead Cottage as Miss Jane Marple reached for her dressing gown. At precisely 6:30 each morning, she would descend to her kitchen to prepare the first pot of tea of the day, a ritual as dependable as the sunrise itself. But this particular Tuesday morning in late September, something was decidedly amiss in the village of St Mary Mead. As she shuffled toward the front door to retrieve her daily pint of milk, Miss Marple paused. There, gleaming dully in the morning light, sat not the familiar modern bottle she expected, but something altogether different. The bottle was shorter and considerably thicker than the usual delivery, fashioned from heavy pre-war glass that caught the light in a way that spoke of craftsmanship from a bygone era. Most peculiar of all were the initials etched deep into the glass, H.B. How very odd, she murmured to herself, adjusting her spectacles for a closer examination. The bottle felt substantial in her hands, the glass thick and reassuring in a way that modern containers simply were not. She turned it slowly, noting the precision of the engraving, the careful spacing of the letters. From across the lane came the distinctive creak of Mrs. Bantry's front gate, followed by an exclamation of surprise. Miss Marple looked up to see her neighbour standing in her doorway, holding an identical bottle and wearing an expression of complete bewilderment. "Jane!" Mrs. Bantry called out, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Do you see this? What on earth has happened to our milk?" Before Miss Marple could respond, other doors began opening along the street. Mrs. Weatherby emerged from Rose Cottage, bottle in hand, followed by Colonel Melchett from the old vicarage, and young Dr. Haydock from his surgery. Each held the same peculiar bottle, each bearing the same mysterious initials. "Most irregular," declared Colonel Melchett, his military bearing evident even in his hastily donned dressing gown. "Where's Harold got to?" Never known him to miss his rounds in 15 years. Indeed, Harold Briggs and his familiar horse-drawn float were nowhere to be seen. The usual clip-clop of hooves and gentle rattle of bottles that mark the early morning hours had been absent, Miss Marple now realised. She had attributed the unusual quiet to her own drowsiness, but clearly something more significant was at play. As the villagers gathered in the lane, comparing their mysterious deliveries, Miss Marple made a mental note of the distribution. Every house on Harold's regular route had received exactly one bottle, regardless of their usual order. Mrs. Bantry typically took 2 pints daily, while the Weatherbys required 3 for their household of 5, yet each had received precisely one of the peculiar bottles. "The initials," observed Dr. Haydock, pushing his wire-rimmed spectacles up his nose. "H.B. Harold Briggs, obviously, but why would he engrave his own initials on milk bottles?" "And where did he get them?" added Mrs. Weatherby, her voice tinged with concern. "These aren't from Turner's Dairy, surely? They look positively ancient." Miss Marple examined her bottle more closely, noting the absence of the familiar red and white logo that adorned all containers from Turner's Modern Dairy. These bottles bore no marking save for the etched initials and appeared to have been stored somewhere dusty for quite some time. She rubbed her finger along the base and felt the accumulated grime of years. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "we should contact the dairy. Mr. Turner will surely know where Harold has gone." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that had served her so well in past mysteries. In her experience, when the ordinary routine of village life was disrupted in such a peculiar manner, it rarely proved to be a simple matter of confusion or accident. Mrs. Bantry was already striding toward the telephone box at the corner of the lane, her determination evident in every step. The others followed, their voices rising in a chorus of speculation and concern. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, studying the bottle in her hands once more. The workmanship was exquisite, she noted. The letters had been etched with considerable skill, their depth and spacing suggesting the work of a professional engraver. This was no hasty job performed in a moment of whimsy, but a careful, deliberate piece of craftsmanship that would have required both time and expertise. She turned the bottle to examine the base, where she discovered a faint blue marking, the number 2. How curious. She glanced toward Mrs. Bantry's bottle, abandoned on her doorstep, and noted a similar marking, the number 4. Most interesting, she murmured, her fingers tracing the numeral. In her long experience of village mysteries, she had learned that seemingly random details often prove to be anything but random. The sound of Mrs. Bantry's voice carried from the telephone box, rising in pitch as she presumably spoke with someone from the dairy. Miss Marple made her way slowly toward the group, her mind already working through the implications of what she had observed. As she approached, she could hear fragments of Mrs. Bantry's conversation. No, he never arrived. Bottles with initials. Yes, H.B. Most peculiar thing. When Mrs. Bantry finally emerged from the telephone box, her face was flushed with indignation. Mr. Turner was positively rude, she announced to the assembled group. Said Harold's probably sleeping off a drinking bout and that young Tom Perry will cover the deliveries. Wouldn't hear a word about these bottles. Sleeping off a drinking bout? Colonel Melchert's voice rose in outrage. Harold Briggs has been teetotal for 20 years, never touched a drop since he married Edna. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Harold Briggs was indeed a man of impeccable habits and sobriety, qualities that had made him a trusted figure in the village for many years. The suggestion that he would simply fail to appear for his duties without explanation was entirely out of character. "I think," she said quietly, "we should call upon Mrs. Briggs. She'll be worried sick by now." The group murmured agreement, but Miss Marple's attention had already shifted to the bottles they all carried. Whatever had happened to Harold Briggs, she felt certain that these peculiar containers held the key to understanding it. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the village lane, Miss Marple clutched her mysterious bottle a little tighter. In her bones, she could feel the familiar stirring that preceded a puzzle worth solving, and she had learned long ago to trust that instinct completely. Chapter 2. A Missing Milkman. By 9:30, the morning's peculiar events had taken on a more serious complexion. Miss Marple had accompanied Mrs. Bantry to the modest cottage, where Harold and Edna Briggs had lived for the past 12 years, and the scene that greeted them was one of barely controlled panic. Edna Briggs sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Her usually neat appearance was dishevelled, her greying hair escaping from its customary pins, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had spent the night in sleepless worry. "He left at 4 o'clock sharp," she was saying to Inspector Slack, who had arrived only moments before Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry. "Same as always, Inspector. Harold's never been one to break his routine. Up at 3:30, quick wash and shave, cup of tea and a slice of bread and butter, then off to the dairy to load his float." Inspector Slack, a man whose impatience with village mysteries was legendary, made a note in his book with obvious reluctance. "And you heard nothing unusual during the night, Mrs. Briggs? No sounds of disturbance?" "Nothing at all," Edna replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a light sleeper, Inspector. If Harold had come back during the night, I would have heard him. The floorboards creak something dreadful in the hall." Miss Marple settled herself quietly in the corner chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and observed the proceedings with the keen attention that had served her so well in past mysteries. She noted the way Edna's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her cup, the careful way she avoided looking directly at Inspector Slack, and the small pile of Harold's work clothes laid out on the chair by the window. "Mrs. Briggs," Miss Marple said gently, "forgive me for asking, but was Harold particularly concerned about anything lately? His work, perhaps, or the dairy?" Edna's eyes flickered toward her, and Miss Marple caught a fleeting expression of something that might have been relief at being asked a question she could answer honestly. "Well," Edna began hesitantly, "he had been rather quiet these past few weeks. Came home from his rounds, looking thoughtful, you might say. When I asked him about it, he just said there were things about the dairy that didn't sit right with him." "What sort of things?" Inspector Slack interjected, his pen poised over his notebook. "He wouldn't say exactly. Harold's always been careful not to speak ill of his employers, but I got the impression he thought something wasn't quite proper about the way the accounts were being handled." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. In her experience, financial irregularities in small businesses often led to complications that could spiral far beyond simple bookkeeping errors. "Did he mention Mr. Turner specifically?" she asked. "Not by name, but—" Edna paused, glancing nervously at Inspector Slack. "Harold did say once that it was funny how some customers seemed to be charged more than others for the same service. He'd been doing the rounds long enough to know who ordered what, and he noticed discrepancies." Before Inspector Slack could respond, the sound of a motor vehicle approaching interrupted the conversation. Through the lace curtains, Miss Marple could see a modern delivery lorry bearing the red and white logo of Turner's Modern Dairy pulling up outside the cottage. A young man in his early 20s climbed down from the driver's seat, his movements quick and nervous. He wore the standard dairy uniform, but it hung awkwardly on his slight frame, as though it had been hastily pressed into service. This, Miss Marple surmised, must be Tom Perry, the assistant mentioned by Mr. Turner. Tom knocked hesitantly at the door, and when Edna opened it, he removed his cap and twisted it between his hands. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Briggs," he said, his voice betraying his youth and uncertainty. "Mr. Turner sent me to ask if you'd heard anything from Harold. He's that worried about the morning deliveries." Inspector Slack stepped forward, his official manner asserting itself. "I'm Inspector Slack. You're Tom Perry, I take it? The dairy assistant?" "Yes, sir. That is, I was just helping out in the yard mostly, but Mr. Turner's put me on deliveries now that—" He gestured helplessly toward the cottage. "When did you last see Harold Briggs?" Slack demanded. Tom's brow furrowed in concentration. "Yesterday evening, sir. He came by the dairy around 6 to settle his float for the night. Same as always. Seemed perfectly normal to me." "And this morning? You were at the dairy when he should have arrived?" "Well, no, sir. I don't usually start till 7. But Mr. Turner was there early, and he told me Harold hadn't shown up. Said I was to take over his route temporary-like." Miss Marple studied the young man carefully. There was something in his manner that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with his sudden promotion to delivery duties. His hands continued to worry at his cap, and his eyes darted frequently toward the lorry outside. "Mr. Perry," she said in her gentle voice, "I noticed that you're using the modern bottles for your deliveries today, the ones with the dairy's logo." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Turner's very particular about that. Says it's important for the business image. All the bottles matching and looking professional." "Of course. And you wouldn't happen to know anything about some rather unusual bottles that were delivered this morning? Older bottles, with initials engraved in the glass?" Tom's face went pale, and he glanced quickly at Inspector Slack before returning his attention to Miss Marple. "I don't know anything about any special bottles, ma'am. Mr. Turner just told me to use the regular stock and make sure every house on Harold's route got their usual order." But Miss Marple had caught the slight hesitation in his voice, the way his grip tightened on his cap. In her long experience of observing human nature, she had learned to recognize the signs of someone who was not telling the complete truth. "How long have you been working at the dairy, Mr. Perry?" she asked. "About 6 months, ma'am, since I left school. Mr. Turner took me on as a favour to my mother, really. She does his books once a week." This information was filed away in Miss Marple's mental catalogue of potentially significant details. The son of the woman who handled the dairy's financial records was now taking over the route of a man who had apparently noticed irregularities in the billing. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. "Right then, I'll need to speak with Mr. Turner directly. Mrs. Briggs, if your husband hasn't returned by evening, we'll need to consider this a formal missing person case." As the inspector prepared to leave, Miss Marple rose from her chair and approached Tom Perry, who was still standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Mr. Perry," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might do me a small favour. I'm rather curious about those bottles I mentioned. If you should happen to come across any information about them, I'd be most grateful if you'd let me know." Tom nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly, and hurried back to his lorry. Miss Marple watched from the window as he drove away, noting the careful way he handled the vehicle and the frequency with which he glanced in his mirrors. "Poor boy seems nervous," Mrs. Bantry observed. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "though whether from the responsibility of his new duties or from something else entirely I couldn't say." As they prepared to leave Edna Briggs to her worry and her cold tea, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's revelations. Harold Briggs had disappeared after expressing concerns about the dairy's accounting practices. His replacement was the son of the woman who maintained those very accounts, and somewhere in the village, a set of carefully engraved bottles had been distributed with mysterious precision. In her experience, such coincidences rarely proved to be coincidental at all. Chapter 3. Engraver in Retirement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green as Miss Marple made her way along the narrow lane that led to Woodbine Cottage. She had spent the better part of the morning in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she considered the peculiar circumstances surrounding Harold Briggs's disappearance and those mysterious bottles. The quality of the engraving had impressed her greatly. The initials HB had been etched with such precision and artistry that they spoke of professional skill rather than amateur effort. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, there were precious few individuals capable of such work, and Miss Marple's methodical mind had quickly settled upon one particular candidate. Mr. Geoffrey Wilcox had been the village's most skilled craftsman for over 30 years. His workshop, tucked away behind his cottage garden, had produced countless silver trophies for the local cricket club, tennis society, and various other village organisations. The delicate script that adorned these prizes had become his signature, recognised throughout the county for its elegance and precision. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, noting the well-tended roses and the neat rows of vegetables that spoke of a man who took pride in his work, whether it involved precious metals or humble cabbages. The cottage itself was small but immaculately maintained, its windows gleaming and its paintwork fresh. She could hear the faint sounds of work coming from the workshop at the rear of the property, the gentle tap of a hammer, the whisper of a file against metal. Mr. Wilcox, despite his 70-odd years, clearly continued to pursue his craft. "Mr. Wilcox," she called out as she approached the open workshop door, "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." The sounds ceased immediately, and a moment later Geoffrey Wilcox appeared in the doorway. He was a small, neat man with silver hair and hands that, despite his age, remained steady and sure. His leather apron bore the stains of years of metal work, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to working with the finest details. "Miss Marple?" he exclaimed, his face brightening with genuine pleasure. "What a delightful surprise! Please do come in. I was just finishing up a small commission." The workshop was a testament to organised craftsmanship. Tools hung in precise arrangements along the walls, and the workbench was laid out with the methodical care of someone who understood that efficiency came from order. The air held the familiar sense of metal polish and the sharp tang of acid used for etching. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced," Miss Marple said, settling herself on the wooden stool that Mr. Wilcox offered. "I find myself rather curious about something, and I thought you might be able to help." "Of course, my dear lady. Always happy to assist." Miss Marple withdrew the mysterious milk bottle from her knitting bag and placed it carefully on the workbench. "I wondered if you might tell me something about this engraving." Mr. Wilcox picked up the bottle and examined it closely, his experienced fingers tracing the letters with obvious appreciation. "Beautiful work," he murmured. "Whoever did this knew their craft. The depth is perfect, the spacing exact. Not easy to achieve on curved glass either." "You recognise the technique?" Indeed I do. This is acid etching done with a resist pattern. Takes considerable skill to get it this clean. He paused, setting the bottle down with perhaps a touch more care than necessary. May I ask where you came by this? Miss Marple sensed a subtle shift in his manner, a barely perceptible tension that hadn't been there moments before. It was delivered to my cottage this morning, along with similar bottles to every house on Harold Briggs's milk route. Rather mysterious, wouldn't you say? Mr. Wilcox moved to his workbench and began tidying tools that were already perfectly arranged. Harold Briggs, you say? The milkman? Yes. He seems to have gone missing, I'm afraid. The bottles appeared in his absence, each one bearing his initials. Miss Marple watched carefully as she spoke, noting the way Mr. Wilcox's movements became more deliberate, more controlled. Most peculiar, he said, though his tone suggested he found it less surprising than he claimed. Miss Marple's sharp eyes had been scanning the workshop as they spoke, and now they fixed upon something that made her pulse quicken slightly. Near the edge of the workbench, partially concealed by a leather tool roll, lay a small piece of glass. Even from her position, she could see the familiar gleam of thick pre-war glass and the unmistakable curve of a bottle fragment. Mr. Wilcox, she said gently, I wonder if you might have had occasion to work with glass recently. I know your specialty is silver work, but perhaps someone commissioned you to try something different. The old craftsman's hand stilled on his tools. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, and Miss Marple could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his head drooped slightly as though he carried a burden he had hoped to avoid. You're very observant, Miss Marple, he said finally, turning to face her. I should have known better than to think I could keep anything from you. He moved to the workbench and carefully lifted the tool roll, revealing the glass fragment beneath. Miss Marple could see immediately that it bore the same style of etching as the bottle she'd brought, the letters HB clearly visible despite the shard's small size. Harold did come to me, Mr. Wilcox admitted, his voice heavy with reluctance. About 3 weeks ago. He had a dozen of these old bottles with him, wanted me to engrave his initials on each one, said it was for a joke, something to surprise the village. A joke? Miss Marple's tone was carefully neutral, but her mind was working rapidly. Nothing she had learned about Harold Briggs suggested he was given to practical jokes, particularly ones that would disrupt his careful routine. That's what he said. Paid me well for it too. More than the work was worth, really, but he was most insistent that I keep the job quiet. Said it wouldn't be funny if word got out beforehand. Mr. Wilcox picked up the glass fragment and examined it closely. I had to practice the technique first, you understand. Haven't worked with glass in years. This was my test piece, from a bottle he brought that was already cracked. Miss Marple studied the fragment, noting the freshness of the etching and the telltale marks where it had been recently filed. And you completed the work? Yes, about a week ago. Harold collected them all, seemed very pleased with the result. I must say I was rather proud of the job myself. Not easy to get that consistency across a dozen bottles. Did he mention where he had acquired the bottles? They appear to be quite old. Mr. Wilcox shook his head. No, he just said he'd come across them somewhere. They were dusty, that's certain. I had to clean them thoroughly before I could begin the etching process. Miss Marple rose from her stool and approached the workbench, her eyes taking in every detail of the workshop with renewed interest. Mr. Wilcox, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I believe Harold may have been in some sort of difficulty. The bottles weren't intended as a joke. I'm quite certain of that. The old craftsman's face crumpled slightly. I wondered about that myself, Miss Marple. Harold's always been such a straightforward man. When he asked me to keep the work secret, it didn't sit quite right with me. But he seemed so earnest about it, and he was paying his own money. Of course you couldn't have known, Miss Marple said reassuringly. But tell me, when he collected the bottles, did he say anything about his plans for them? Only that he hoped they would help set things right. He seemed worried about something, though he wouldn't say what. Just kept repeating that sometimes a man had to take matters into his own hands. Miss Marple carefully wrapped the original bottle back in her knitting and prepared to leave. As she reached the workshop door, she turned back to Mr. Wilcox. You mentioned the bottles were dusty when Harold brought them to you. Did you notice anything else about them? Any markings or numbers?" Mr. Wilcox frowned in concentration. "Now that you mention it, yes. Each one had a small number painted on the bottom in blue. Harold was very particular about keeping them in order, made me promise to engrave them in sequence according to those numbers." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And you remember the sequence? Even numbers, starting from 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on up to 24, if I recall correctly. Harold said the order was important, though he wouldn't explain why." As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, her mind was busy with this new information. Harold Briggs had commissioned a set of engraved bottles weeks before his disappearance, arranging them in a specific numerical sequence. Whatever message or purpose those bottles served, it was clearly far more complex than a simple practical joke. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as she reached her cottage, and she settled into her favourite armchair with her knitting. But her fingers worked automatically while her thoughts remained focused on the mystery at hand. Somewhere in the sequence of those bottles, in the careful arrangement of their numbers, lay the key to understanding what had happened to Harold Briggs. And Miss Marple was determined to find it. Chapter 4, Clue in the Crate Numbers. The evening light filtered through the windows of Danemead Cottage as Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk, a sheet of paper before her, and her fountain pen poised thoughtfully above it. The mysterious milk bottle sat nearby, its engraved initials catching the lamplight, while she contemplated the information Mr. Wilcox had provided. 12 bottles, numbered in sequence from 2 to 24, using only even numbers. The precision of it suggested a deliberate pattern, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that in matters of human behaviour, patterns rarely emerged without purpose. She had spent the better part of an hour after her return from the engraver's workshop, walking through the village, making careful note of which houses had received the mysterious bottles. Now, as she sat with her observation spread before her, she began to see something that made her pulse quicken with the familiar excitement of discovery. Taking up her pen, she began to write out the house numbers in the order of Harold's regular delivery route: 2 Meadowside Lane, 4 Meadowside Lane, 6 Rose Cottage Lane, 8 Rose Cottage Lane, and so forth. Each corresponded exactly to the numbered bottles Mr. Wilcox had described, but it was when she began to consider the names of the residents that the true pattern emerged. Number 2, Mrs. Carmichael at Meadowside Lane. Number 4, Mr. Roberts at Meadowside Lane. Number 6, Mrs. Enderby at Rose Cottage Lane. Number 8, Dr. Albury at Rose Cottage Lane. Miss Marple paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She wrote out the first letters of each surname: C-R-E-A. The beginning of something was taking shape, but she needed more information to be certain. Rising from her desk, she reached for her coat and made her way back into the village. The evening was mild, and several of her neighbours were tending their gardens or taking their customary after-dinner strolls. It would be a simple matter to verify her growing suspicion. Her first stop was at the home of Mrs. Melhuish, who lived at number 10 on Harold's route. The elderly woman was deadheading her roses and greeted Miss Marple with evident pleasure. "Such a strange day," Mrs. Melhuish declared without preamble. "First those peculiar bottles this morning, and now young Tom Perry delivering our regular milk in the afternoon. I do hope nothing serious has happened to Harold." "I'm sure it will all be sorted out soon," Miss Marple replied soothingly. "I wonder, might I have a quick look at the bottle you received this morning? I'm rather curious about something." Mrs. Melhuish retrieved the bottle from her kitchen, and Miss Marple examined the base carefully. There, in faint blue paint, was the number 10, just as she had expected. She made a mental note. M for Melhuish. "Thank you so much, my dear," she said, returning the bottle. "I don't suppose you noticed anything else unusual about it?" "Well, it was certainly heavier than our usual bottles, and dusty, as though it had been stored somewhere for quite some time. But the milk inside was perfectly fresh." Miss Marple continued her circuit of the village, stopping at each house that had received one of the mysterious bottles. At number 12 she confirmed that Mrs. Simmons had received a bottle bearing that number. At number 14, the vicarage, she learned that Reverend Clement had indeed received a bottle, though he had already disposed of it, finding the whole matter rather bewildering. By the time she reached number 20, where young Mrs. Hartwell lived with her 3 children, Miss Marple was quite certain of her theory. Each bottle had been delivered to a specific address, and the sequence was no accident. Back at her cottage, she laid out her findings with methodical precision. 2, Carmichael, C4, Roberts, 6, Enderby, E8, Albury, a 10, Melhuish, M12, Simmons, S14, Clement, H, though she noted this bottle had apparently been discarded, 16, Erskine, E18, Davies, D20, Hartwell, H22, Emerson, E24, Dunbar, D. The pattern was unmistakable now. Reading the first letters of the surnames in order, they spelled out a clear message: Creamshedhed. Miss Marple frowned slightly, adjusting her spectacles. The message seemed to run together, but with careful consideration she could see that it was meant to be read as 2 words: cream shed. She sat back in her chair, her mind working rapidly. Harold Briggs had gone to considerable trouble and expense to create these bottles, arranging for them to be delivered in a specific sequence that would spell out this message. But why? And what was the significance of the cream shed? Miss Marple was familiar with the old cream shed that stood behind Turner's Modern Dairy. It was a relic from the days when the business had been smaller and less mechanised, used for storing the thick cream that was separated from the milk before pasteurisation. In recent years, with Turner's installation of modern equipment, the shed had fallen into disuse. But Harold's message suggested it was somehow significant to his current predicament. There was, however, one troubling aspect to her discovery. According to Mr. Wilcox, Harold had commissioned 12 bottles, numbered from 2 to 24. Yet the message as she had decoded it required only 11 bottles to spell out Creamshed. What had happened to the 12th bottle? Miss Marple rose and walked to her window, gazing out at the darkening village. Somewhere in this puzzle lay the answer to Harold's disappearance, but she needed more information before she could act upon her discovery. As she stood there, she noticed a familiar figure walking briskly down the lane. It was Tom Perry, still in his dairy uniform, carrying what appeared to be a crate of empty bottles. Even in the dim light, she could see that he seemed agitated, frequently looking over his shoulder as though he expected to be followed. On impulse, Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage and called to him softly, "Mr. Perry, good evening." The young man started violently, nearly dropping his crate. "Miss Marple, you gave me quite a fright." "I do apologise. I noticed you were working rather late this evening." Tom shifted the crate nervously. "Yes. Well, Mr. Turner wanted me to collect all the empty bottles from today's deliveries. Says it's important to keep proper track of the stock." Miss Marple moved closer, her sharp eyes taking in the contents of the crate. Most of the bottles bore the familiar red and white logo of Turner's Modern Dairy, but there, nestled among them, she could see at least 3 of the mysterious HB bottles. "I see you've managed to retrieve some of the unusual bottles from this morning," she observed casually. Tom's face flushed in the lamplight. "Oh, those. Yes. Well, Mr. Turner said we needed to collect them all. Can't have unauthorised bottles in circulation, he said. Bad for the business image." "Of course. I imagine he was quite concerned about them." "Very concerned," Tom agreed, perhaps a bit too quickly. Said he'd never seen anything like them before. Couldn't imagine where they'd come from. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. If Turner was claiming ignorance about the bottles, it suggested that Harold's message was indeed intended to expose something that his employer preferred to keep hidden. "Well, I mustn't keep you from your work," she said pleasantly. "Good evening, Mr. Perry." As Tom hurried away, Miss Marple noticed that he had failed to collect the bottle from her own cottage. Whether this was an oversight or deliberate, she couldn't say, but it meant she still had physical evidence of Harold's elaborate message. Returning to her cottage, she settled once more at her writing desk and began to plan her next move. The cream shed held the key to this mystery, she was certain of it. But she would need to be careful. If Harold Briggs had felt the need to communicate through such an elaborate code, it suggested that direct confrontation might be dangerous. She glanced at the clock on her mantelpiece. It was past 9 o'clock, and the village was settling into its evening quiet. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find an opportunity to examine the cream shed more closely. But tonight she would content herself with the satisfaction of having decoded Harold's ingenious message. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on the milkman's cleverness. Using his intimate knowledge of his delivery route and the surnames of his customers, he had created a communication system that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't possess both pieces of information. It was the work of a frightened but resourceful man, and it filled her with both admiration and concern for Harold's welfare. The cream shed would yield its secrets tomorrow, she was certain of it. Chapter 5. The Shed Search. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, with a chill in the air that spoke of autumn's approach. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual, her mind already focused on the task ahead. Harold's coded message had pointed clearly to the old cream shed behind Turner's modern dairy, and she was determined to discover what secrets it might hold. By 9:30, she had made her way to the village centre under the pretext of purchasing stamps at the post office. From there, it was a simple matter to observe the comings and goings at the dairy without appearing overly curious. Turner's establishment occupied a prominent position on the high street, its modern glass frontage and gleaming equipment visible through large windows that spoke of prosperity and progress. She watched as Tom Perry loaded his delivery lorry for the morning rounds, his movements still betraying the nervousness she had observed the evening before. Mr. Turner himself appeared briefly in the doorway, his stocky figure immediately recognisable even at a distance. He spoke tersely to Tom, gesturing toward the lorry with obvious impatience before disappearing back into the building. Miss Marple waited until the lorry had departed, then made her way around to the rear of the dairy premises. The contrast with the modern frontage was striking. Here, the buildings showed their age, with weathered brick walls and slate roofs that spoke of an earlier, simpler time in the dairy's history. The cream shed stood apart from the main building, connected by a covered walkway that had seen better days. It was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 20 feet square, with a single door and 2 grimy windows set high in the walls. Most significantly, the door was secured with a heavy padlock that showed signs of rust and age. Miss Marple was examining this padlock when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to find Inspector Slack striding toward her, his expression a mixture of exasperation and resignation. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I might have known I'd find you here. Mrs. Briggs said you'd been asking questions about those bottles yesterday." "Good morning, Inspector. I was simply taking a constitutional and noticed this interesting old building. One doesn't often see such fine examples of Victorian dairy architecture these days." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he was not entirely convinced by this explanation, but before he could respond, another voice interrupted them. "Inspector, what brings you to my premises so early in the morning?" Oswald Turner emerged from the main building, his face bearing an expression of barely concealed irritation. He was a man in his 50s, with thinning hair and the soft appearance of someone who had spent more time behind a desk than in physical labour. His clothes were expensive, but somehow managed to look slightly shabby on his frame. "Mr. Turner," Inspector Slack replied formally, "I'm investigating the disappearance of Harold Briggs. I understand this shed was used for cream storage in the past." Turner's eyes flicked nervously between the inspector and Miss Marple. The old cream shed? Good heavens, that thing hasn't been used in years, not since I installed the modern pasteurising equipment. It's probably full of nothing but dust and cobwebs now. Nevertheless, I'd like to have a look inside, if you don't mind." "Well, I suppose, though I can't imagine what you expect to find. The thing's been locked up for the better part of 2 years. Turner fumbled in his pocket and produced a ring of keys. "I'm not even sure I have the right key anymore." Miss Marple watched carefully as Turner approached the padlock. His hands shook slightly as he tried several keys, and she noticed a fine sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool morning air. When the padlock finally clicked open, he seemed almost startled by the sound. Inspector Slack pushed open the heavy wooden door, and immediately the smell hit them, a mixture of old hay, damp wood, and something else that Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. As their eyes adjusted to the dim interior, the reason for Harold's disappearance became shockingly clear. There, in the centre of the shed, stood Harold's familiar milk float, its red paint dulled by dust but otherwise intact. Beside it, munching contentedly on a pile of fresh hay, was Harold's horse, Maggie, who looked up at them with mild curiosity before returning to her meal. "Good Lord," breathed Inspector Slack, "how long has this been here?" But Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else entirely. Leaning against the far wall was a long wooden paddle, the kind used for stirring large vats of cream. The wood was stained dark near the handle, and when she moved closer she could see what appeared to be flecks of dried blood. "Don't touch anything," Inspector Slack commanded, though Miss Marple had already stepped carefully around the evidence. "This is now a crime scene." Turner stood in the doorway, his face pale and his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish out of water. "I don't understand," he stammered. "How did all this get here? I had no idea." Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the milk float and peered underneath. There, partially hidden beneath the vehicle, was a torn piece of paper. She pointed it out to Inspector Slack, who retrieved it with his handkerchief. "It appears to be part of a ledger," he observed, holding it up to the light from the doorway. 3 months' worth of entries by the look of it, but the writing's too faded to make out the details. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "One wonders why someone would tear pages from a ledger and hide them under a milk float." Turner's agitation had increased visibly. "Look here, Inspector, I run a legitimate business. I don't know anything about any missing ledger pages. This is all completely irregular." "Indeed it is, Mr. Turner. I'll need to speak with you at length about your employee's disappearance. But first, I want this shed thoroughly searched." As Inspector Slack began his methodical examination of the shed's contents, Miss Marple noticed several other details that struck her as significant. The hay that Maggie was eating appeared fresh, suggesting someone had been caring for the horse regularly. There were also several empty bottles scattered about, though none bore the distinctive HB markings she had come to associate with Harold's message. Most intriguingly, she observed that the door, while secured with the old padlock, showed signs of recent use. The hinges, though rusty, moved smoothly, and there were fresh scratches in the dirt floor near the entrance. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe someone has been using this shed regularly, despite Mr. Turner's claims to the contrary." "What makes you say that?" Miss Marple pointed to the evidence, the fresh hay, the smooth-moving door, the recent disturbance of the floor. "And notice how calm the horse is. If she had been confined here against her will, she would show signs of distress. Instead, she seems quite comfortable with her surroundings." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "So someone has been keeping Harold's float and horse here deliberately. The question is, why, and where is Harold himself?" Turner had remained silent during this exchange, but Miss Marple could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Whatever was happening here, she was certain he knew more than he was letting on. "Mr. Turner," she said conversationally, "I don't suppose you've noticed anything unusual about your accounts lately? Any discrepancies or irregularities?" The dairy owner's face flushed red. "My accounts are perfectly in order, thank you very much. I don't see what business that is of yours anyway." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I was simply wondering if Harold might have noticed something that concerned him. He was such a conscientious man, always careful about details." The implication hung in the air between them, and Turner's discomfort was palpable. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, had completed his initial examination of the shed and was preparing to seal it as evidence. "Right then," he announced, "this shed is off limits until further notice. Mr. Turner, I'll need you to come to the station for questioning, and I'll want to speak with your assistant, Tom Perry, as well." As they prepared to leave the shed, Miss Marple took one last look around. Somewhere in this puzzle of missing ledger pages, blood-stained paddles and hidden vehicles lay the key to Harold's disappearance. But she suspected that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. The grey morning had given way to steady drizzle, and as they walked back toward the village centre, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The discovery of Harold's float had answered some questions, but it had raised far more troubling ones. Where was Harold Briggs, and what had happened to him in this dusty shed? Chapter 6, Body by the Separator. The remainder of that Wednesday passed in a state of subdued tension throughout St. Mary Mead. News of the discovery in the cream shed had spread with the inevitable swiftness of village gossip, and by evening clusters of residents could be seen discussing the matter in hushed tones outside the post office and village shop. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles moving steadily as she pondered the implications of what they had found. The blood-stained paddle troubled her greatly, as did the careful way Harold's equipment had been concealed. Someone had gone to considerable lengths to hide the evidence, yet had continued to care for Harold's horse. It suggested a complexity of motive that went beyond simple violence. Inspector Slack had taken both Turner and Tom Perry to the police station for questioning, but by 6 o'clock both men had been released pending further investigation. Miss Marple had observed Turner's return to the dairy from her cottage window, noting the man's agitated state and the frequency with which he glanced about as though expecting to be watched. As the evening shadows lengthened, she noticed lights burning late in the dairy building. Turner's silhouette moved back and forth behind the windows of his office, and occasionally she could see him in the main processing area, apparently working with the large cream separator that was the pride of his modern operation. It was just past 11 o'clock when Miss Marple was startled from her reading by the sound of screaming. The piercing cries cut through the quiet of the village night, coming unmistakably from the direction of the dairy. Without hesitation, she threw on her coat and made her way quickly toward the disturbance. Other villagers were emerging from their homes, attracted by the commotion. Dr. Haydock was hurrying down the lane from his surgery, his medical bag in hand, while Colonel Melchett strode purposefully from the direction of the old vicarage. The screaming had stopped by the time they reached the dairy, but lights blazed from every window of the building. The front door stood wide open, and from within came the sound of someone sobbing hysterically. They found Edna Briggs just inside the main processing room, her face white with shock and her hands pressed to her mouth. She was staring at something near the large cream separator, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of terror. "Mrs. Briggs," Dr. Haydock said gently, moving to her side, "what's happened here?" "I came looking for Harold," she managed between sobs. "I couldn't sleep, and I thought maybe he'd come back and was working late, trying to make up for lost time. But when I looked in..." Miss Marple followed the direction of Edna's horrified gaze and immediately understood the cause of her distress. Oswald Turner lay crumpled beside the massive cream separator, his skull clearly crushed by a blow from the same wooden paddle they had discovered earlier in the shed. The implement lay nearby, its dark stains now glistening wetly as it thawed in the warmth of the processing room. But it was the state of the separator itself that drew Miss Marple's particular attention. The heavy cover bolts had been loosened, and thick cream had flooded across the floor, creating a treacherous, slippery surface around the machine. Steam rose from the pipes that fed the separator, suggesting it had been running at full capacity when the accident occurred. "Don't touch anything," Colonel Melchett commanded, though his military bearing couldn't entirely mask his shock at the scene. "This is clearly a matter for the police." Dr. Haydock knelt carefully beside Turner's body, avoiding the spreading pool of cream. "Dead for several hours, I'd say. The injury is consistent with a blow from that paddle." Miss Marple moved carefully around the edge of the room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The separator's control panel showed signs of recent adjustment, and there were wet footprints leading from the machine toward the office area. Most significantly, she noticed that several of the cover bolts lay scattered on the floor, as though they had been deliberately removed and carelessly discarded. "Mrs. Briggs," she said gently, "when you arrived, was the front door unlocked?" Edna nodded mutely, still too shaken to speak coherently. "And the lights were already on?" Another nod. Miss Marple continued her examination, noting that Turner's office door was ajar and papers were scattered across his desk. Among them she could see what appeared to be ledger sheets, and several invoices bearing the dairy's letterhead. Inspector Slack arrived within minutes, summoned by Dr. Haydock's telephone call. His examination of the scene was thorough if somewhat predictable, focusing primarily on the obvious evidence, the body, the weapon, and the dangerous condition of the separator. "Looks like Turner was working late and had some sort of accident," he pronounced after his initial survey. "Must have been trying to fix the separator when those bolts came loose. Machine would have been running at pressure, cream everywhere, slippery as anything. He slips, hits his head on that paddle someone left propped against the wall. Miss Marple found herself disagreeing silently with this assessment. The positioning of the paddle struck her as too convenient, too precisely placed to have been merely propped against the wall. And the pattern of the cream spillage suggested that the separator had been deliberately sabotaged rather than suffering a mechanical failure. "Inspector," she said carefully, "I wonder if you've noticed the colour of those bolts on the floor?" Slack glanced down irritably. "What about them?" "They appear to be marked with blue chalk, the same blue that's used to number the delivery crates, if I'm not mistaken." This observation caused Slack to look more closely at the evidence. Sure enough, each of the scattered bolts bore traces of blue carpenter's chalk, suggesting they had been deliberately marked before being removed. "And notice the pattern of the cream spillage," Miss Marple continued. "It seems to radiate outward from the separator in a way that suggests the cover was removed while the machine was running at full pressure. That would require considerable planning and knowledge of the equipment." Dr. Haydock had completed his preliminary examination of the body. "Inspector, there's something else you should see. Turner's clothes are soaked with cream, but the pattern suggests he was standing quite close to the separator when it failed. Yet there are no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. Meaning he didn't have time to protect himself from the falling paddle. Either he was caught completely by surprise, or he was already unconscious when he fell," Miss Marple finished quietly. Inspector Slack's expression grew more serious as the implications became clear. "You're suggesting this wasn't an accident?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that someone with considerable knowledge of this equipment deliberately sabotaged the separator, knowing that Turner would be working late tonight. The question is how they knew he would be here, and why they chose such an elaborate method." As if in response to her words, a new voice spoke from the doorway. "Because Turner called me this evening and told me to stay away. Said he had important work to do and didn't want to be disturbed." They turned to see Tom Perry standing in the entrance, his face pale but his voice steady. "I came back because I forgot my jacket, saw all the lights and thought there might be trouble." Miss Marple studied the young man carefully. "Mr. Perry, you work with this equipment regularly. Would you say those bolts could have come loose accidentally?" Tom shook his head without hesitation. "Never. Those bolts are torqued to specific settings and checked daily. Someone would have had to deliberately remove them, and they'd need to know exactly how the separator works to do it safely." The implications hung heavy in the air as Inspector Slack began to grasp the complexity of what they were dealing with. This was no simple accident, but a carefully planned attack that had used Turner's own equipment against him. And somewhere in the growing web of evidence lay the key to understanding not only Turner's death, but Harold Briggs's mysterious disappearance as well. Chapter 7. Blue Chalk and Broken Glass. The following morning brought a crisp autumn clarity to St. Mary Mead, though the atmosphere in the village remained heavy with shock and speculation. Miss Marple had risen early, her mind still occupied with the troubling events at the dairy. Inspector Slack had cordoned off the building as a crime scene, but not before she'd made several careful observations that continued to perplex her. Over her morning tea she reviewed what she knew with methodical precision. Turner's death had been made to appear accidental, yet the evidence clearly suggested deliberate sabotage. The blue chalk markings on the separator bolts were particularly significant, as they indicated someone with intimate knowledge of the dairy's marking system had been involved. It was while she was contemplating this connection that Mrs. Bantry arrived at her cottage, her face flushed with excitement and concern. "Jane, you simply must hear what I've discovered," she announced without preamble. "I was speaking with young Mrs. Perry this morning, Tom's mother, you know, and she mentioned something most peculiar about those blue chalk markings." Miss Marple set down her teacup with interest. "Indeed? What did she tell you?" "Well, it seems that Tom has been using that particular shade of blue chalk for months now to mark his delivery crates. She recognised it immediately because she's the one who orders his supplies. But here's the curious thing. She ordered an extra box of chalk just last week because Tom claimed he'd lost his previous supply." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she happen to mention when exactly this loss occurred?" Tuesday of last week, she said. The very day after Harold made his final delivery. Tom came home that evening quite agitated, claiming someone had stolen his chalk from the dairy. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. The timing was suggestive, particularly given what they now knew about Harold's elaborate message and his concerns about the dairy's accounting practices. I think, she said decisively, I should like to examine the crime scene once more if Inspector Slack will permit it. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had obtained permission to accompany Inspector Slack on a second examination of the dairy. The building seemed strangely quiet without the usual bustle of daily operations, and their footsteps echoed hollowly in the processing room where Turner had met his end. In the clear light of day, the scene appeared even more deliberately arranged than it had the previous evening. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the cream separator, avoiding the chalked outline where Turner's body had lain, and examined the scattered bolts more closely. "Inspector," she said, "notice how these bolts are distributed. They're not simply dropped where they fell, but placed in a rough circle around the separator, almost as though someone wanted to ensure they would be noticed." Slack frowned at the pattern she indicated. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that whoever did this wanted us to find the blue chalk markings. They're not trying to hide their method, but rather to implicate someone specific." Miss Marple moved to the overflow drain near the separator, where something had caught her eye. Glittering among the congealed cream were several small fragments of glass. She pointed them out to Inspector Slack, who carefully retrieved them with tweezers. "Heavy glass," he observed, holding one fragment up to the light. "Pre-war quality, I'd say. And look here, there's part of a letter etched into this piece." Miss Marple examined the fragment closely. The etching was unmistakably the same style as the bottles Harold had commissioned from Mr. Wilcox, and she could make out what appeared to be the letter E. "Most significant," she murmured. "Inspector, I believe this comes from one of Harold's message bottles. But which one?" They spent the next hour conducting a thorough search of the dairy premises. In Turner's office, they discovered the scattered papers Miss Marple had noticed the previous evening, along with several items that had been carefully hidden behind the radiator. "Well, well," Inspector Slack said, pulling out a manila folder that had been wedged behind the heating unit. "What have we here?" The folder contained several pages of ledger entries, torn from their original binding and carefully preserved. Miss Marple recognised them immediately as the missing pages they had found evidence of in the cream shed. "These appear to be the legitimate accounts," she observed, scanning the neat columns of figures. "And notice how they differ from the official ledger entries. The amounts charged to customers are consistently lower than what appears in Turner's official books." Inspector Slack compared the hidden pages with the ledger on Turner's desk. He was padding the bills, charging customers more than the agreed rates and pocketing the difference. Clever scheme, really. Most people wouldn't notice a few pence extra on their weekly milk bill. "But Harold would notice," Miss Marple said quietly. "As the delivery man, he would hear every complaint from customers who questioned their charges, and being the conscientious man he was, he would investigate." She moved to Turner's desk and began examining the scattered invoices more carefully. Among them, she found several carbon copies that bore the distinctive number 14, the same number that should have corresponded to the vicarage in Harold's bottle message. "Inspector, I believe we've found what Harold was trying to preserve. These carbon copies would provide proof of Turner's fraudulent billing practices. The vicarage bottle, number 14, was meant to contain this evidence." "But we never found a bottle at the vicarage," Slack pointed out. "Reverend Clement said he disposed of his—" Miss Marple shook her head. "I suspect bottle number 14 never reached the vicarage at all. Someone intercepted it, broke it to retrieve the evidence Harold had hidden inside, and disposed of the fragments in the separator drain. The implications were becoming clearer. Harold had discovered Turner's embezzlement and had devised an elaborate plan to expose it using his coded bottle system. But someone had learned of his scheme and had taken steps to silence him and destroy the evidence. "The question remains," Inspector Slack said grimly. "Where is Harold Briggs? And who killed Turner?" Miss Marple was examining the glass fragments once more when a thought struck her. "Inspector, I wonder if we might speak with Tom Perry again. There are several questions I should like to ask him." Tom was found at his mother's cottage, having been temporarily suspended from his duties pending the investigation. He appeared even more nervous than before, his hands shaking slightly as he invited them into the small parlour. "Mr. Perry," Miss Marple began gently, "I understand you lost some blue chalk recently. Could you tell us the circumstances?" Tom's face flushed. "It was stolen from my crate in the dairy yard. Someone must have taken it while I was making deliveries." "And you reported this theft to Mr. Turner?" "Well, no. It was only chalk, after all. Didn't seem worth making a fuss about." Miss Marple noticed that Tom avoided meeting her eyes directly. "Mr. Perry, did you know that Harold Briggs had concerns about the dairy's billing practices?" The young man's nervousness increased visibly. "Harold mentioned something about customers complaining, but I didn't pay much attention. Wasn't my concern, was it?" "Of course not," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But I wonder, did Mr. Turner ever ask you to help him with any special tasks? Perhaps something involving the separator equipment?" Tom's face went white. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, Mr. Perry. Those bolts didn't loosen themselves, and whoever sabotaged that separator needed intimate knowledge of how it worked. Knowledge that you, as Turner's assistant, would certainly possess." Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. "Tom Perry, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you tamper with the cream separator on Turner's instructions?" For a long moment Tom sat in silence, his internal struggle visible on his young face. Finally he broke down completely. "He made me do it," he sobbed. "Said if I didn't help him, he'd tell everyone that my mother had been fiddling the books. She hadn't, of course, but who would believe her word against his? He said it would just be a small accident, nothing serious. I never thought anyone would get killed." As Tom Perry's confession poured out, Miss Marple reflected sadly on how greed and fear could corrupt even the most innocent of people. But there were still pieces missing from this puzzle, and she suspected the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. Chapter 8, A Ledger Written Twice. Tom Perry's confession had provided some answers, but Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the gaps that remained in the story. As Inspector Slack completed the formal interview and arranged for Tom to be taken into custody, she requested permission to examine Turner's office once more. "I feel certain there's more evidence to be found," she explained to the inspector. "Turner was a methodical man, despite his dishonesty. Such elaborate fraud requires careful record-keeping." The office was small and cramped, dominated by an oak desk that had seen better days and filing cabinets that spoke of years of accumulated paperwork. Miss Marple began her search systematically, working through each drawer and examining every document with the careful attention that had served her so well in past mysteries. It was behind the radiator, in the narrow space where Turner had hidden the original ledger pages, that she made her most significant discovery. Her searching fingers encountered what felt like a second manila folder, wedged so tightly against the wall that it had been missed in their earlier search. "Inspector," she called quietly, "I believe I've found something else." The folder, when carefully extracted, proved to contain a complete duplicate set of accounts spanning the past 6 months. But these records told a very different story from the official ledger that sat on Turner's desk. Miss Marple spread the papers carefully across the desk surface, comparing entries with practiced efficiency. "How ingenious," she murmured. Turner was keeping 2 sets of books, the official ledger showing the inflated charges, and these hidden records showing what customers actually owed. Inspector Slack peered over her shoulder at the neat columns of figures, so he could keep track of how much he was stealing. Exactly, and notice how meticulous he was about it. Every fraudulent entry is carefully documented, along with the excess amount charged. He was stealing systematically, but he wanted to know precisely how much he was taking from each customer. Miss Marple continued her examination, noting the careful way Turner had organised his deception. Each customer's account showed both the legitimate charge and the inflated amount, with the difference clearly marked in red ink. "But here's what's most interesting," she said, pointing to a series of entries near the bottom of one page. Look at these notations in the margin. They're in different handwriting. The marginal notes were indeed written in a different hand, the letters formed with the careful precision of someone unused to extensive writing. Miss Marple recognised the style immediately from the delivery slips she had seen Harold produce over the years. "These are Harold's notes," she said with certainty. "He was tracking the discrepancies himself, probably after customers began complaining to him about their bills." Inspector Slack studied the annotations carefully. So Harold had figured out Turner's scheme and was building his own case against him. "More than that, I think. Look at this entry here, dated 3 weeks ago." Miss Marple pointed to a particular line that had been heavily underscored in Harold's careful script. Mrs. Weatherby's account. The official charge was 7 shillings and 6pence, but Harold's note shows she only ordered goods worth 5 shillings. A difference of 2 and 6pence hardly seems worth killing for. "Perhaps not individually," Miss Marple agreed, "but look at the pattern across all the accounts. Turner was systematically overcharging every customer on Harold's route by small amounts. Over 6 months, it would add up to a considerable sum." She continued examining the hidden records, noting Harold's increasingly frequent annotations as the weeks progressed. It was clear that the honest milkman had been building a comprehensive case against his employer's fraudulent practices. "Here's something particularly significant," Miss Marple said, indicating a folder tucked inside the back cover of the hidden ledger. "Carbon copies of forged invoices." The carbon papers were thin and delicate, but the evidence they contained was damning. Turner had been creating false invoices to justify his inflated charges, using official dairy letterhead to make them appear legitimate. "And notice this," Miss Marple continued, examining the carbon copies carefully. "These are the documents Harold intended to place in bottle number 14, the one meant for the vicarage. They would have provided irrefutable proof of Turner's fraud." Inspector Slack was beginning to understand the full scope of Turner's deception. So when Harold threatened to expose him... "Turner panicked," Miss Marple finished, "but I don't believe he intended to kill Harold. More likely he meant to frighten him into silence. The blood on that paddle suggests there was violence, but Harold's body wasn't in the shed." She paused, considering the implications. "I think Turner confronted Harold in the cream shed. There was a struggle, and Harold was injured but managed to escape. Turner then hid Harold's equipment to make it appear he had simply disappeared." "But what about Turner's death?" Tom Perry admitted to sabotaging the separator on Turner's orders. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but consider the timing. Turner called Tom that evening and told him to stay away from the dairy. Why would he do that if he was planning to stage his own accident?" The question hung in the air as Miss Marple continued her examination of the office. In the bottom drawer of Turner's desk she found something that made her pause. A small notebook filled with calculations in Turner's handwriting. "Inspector, look at this." Turner was calculating something quite specific. She showed him the notebook, which contained repeated arithmetic involving the word refund and various sums of money. "He was working out how much he would need to repay," Inspector Slack observed, "almost as though he was planning to make restitution." "Indeed, which suggests that something had happened to change his mind about the fraud. Perhaps Harold's disappearance had frightened him more than he expected." Miss Marple was closing the notebook when a loose piece of paper fell from between its pages. The paper bore a simple message in Harold's careful handwriting. "Meet me at the separator room midnight. We need to talk about making this right. H.B." "Good heavens," breathed Inspector Slack. "Harold arranged to meet Turner at the dairy." "So it would appear, but this raises the most troubling question of all." Miss Marple looked up from the note with concern evident in her eyes. "If Harold was alive and well enough to arrange this meeting, why hasn't he come forward since Turner's death? And where is he now?" The discovery of Harold's note changed everything about their understanding of the case. Far from being a victim of Turner's violence, Harold appeared to have been attempting some form of negotiation or reconciliation. But something had gone wrong during that midnight meeting, resulting in Turner's death and Harold's continued absence. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we need to find Harold Briggs as a matter of urgency. He may be the only witness to what really happened in that separator room. You think he's still alive? I think he's hiding somewhere, probably terrified of being blamed for Turner's death. But if my suspicions are correct, Harold Briggs is in very real danger, and time may be running out. As they prepared to leave Turner's office, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception and fear that had led to this tragedy. Turner's greed had set events in motion, but it was Harold's honest attempt to set things right that had ultimately led to disaster. Somewhere in the village, she was certain, Harold Briggs was hiding, possibly injured, and certainly afraid. Finding him before anyone else did had become a matter of life and death. Chapter 9. Confrontation in the Paddock. The urgency of finding Harold Briggs alive had transformed the investigation from a murder inquiry into a desperate search for a missing witness. Miss Marple, accompanied by Inspector Slack and several constables, had spent the better part of Thursday afternoon systematically searching every possible hiding place in and around St Mary Mead. It was Miss Marple who suggested they examine the hay paddock behind the dairy more thoroughly. If Harold has been caring for his horse in the cream shed, she reasoned, he would need access to fresh hay, and a man familiar with the area would know where to find shelter without being observed. The paddock was larger than it appeared from the road, bordered by thick hedgerows that provided ample concealment. Ancient oak trees dotted the field, their spreading branches creating natural shelters that had probably housed farm workers for generations. It was beneath the largest of these oaks that they found him. Harold Briggs emerged from a makeshift shelter constructed of hay bales and old tarpaulins, his appearance shocking those who knew him as the neat, punctual milkman. His clothes were torn and stained, there was a makeshift bandage around his head, and his left arm hung awkwardly at his side, but his eyes held the alert intelligence that Miss Marple remembered, along with a wariness born of several days in hiding. "Harold," Inspector Slack called out, "thank God you're alive, we've been searching everywhere for you." Harold's response was to step back toward his shelter, his good hand raised defensively. "I didn't kill Turner," he said quickly. "I know how it must look, but I swear I didn't kill him." Miss Marple approached slowly, her manner calm and reassuring. "Harold, we know about Turner's fraudulent accounts. We found the ledger pages you hid, and we understand why you were trying to expose him." Some of the tension left Harold's shoulders, but he remained cautious. "You found the evidence? The carbon copies?" "Yes, and much more. But we need to understand what happened that night at the dairy. We found your note arranging to meet Turner." Harold sank down onto a hay bale, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to give him a chance to make things right before I went to the police." "Tell us what happened," Inspector Slack said, settling himself nearby. "Start from the beginning." Harold drew a shaky breath and began his story. "I'd been noticing the discrepancies for weeks. Customers complaining about their bills, amounts that didn't match what I knew they'd ordered. At first I thought it was just confusion, but the pattern was too consistent." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "So you began keeping your own records?" "I had to know for certain before I accused anyone. I started copying down the official charges and comparing them to what customers actually received. That's when I realized Turner was systematically cheating everyone on my route." "And the bottles with your initials?" Harold managed a weak smile. "That was my insurance policy. I knew Turner would deny everything if I confronted him directly. So I had Mr. Wilcox engrave those old bottles I found in the dairy storage room, and I hid copies of the evidence in them. If anything happened to me, someone would eventually figure out the message." "Very clever," Miss Marple observed. "But what made you decide to meet with Turner directly?" Harold's expression darkened. "He cornered me in the cream shed Monday night. Must have suspected I was onto him. We had words, and he grabbed that old paddle, threatening me with it. I tried to get away, and he swung at me." He touched the bandage on his head gingerly. "Caught me a glancing blow, enough to knock me down. I thought he was going to finish me off, but I managed to scramble away in the dark. Been hiding here ever since, trying to figure out what to do." But you wrote that note asking to meet him at the separator room, Inspector Slack pointed out. That was Tuesday evening. I'd had time to think and I realised that running away wouldn't solve anything. I thought if I offered him a chance to make restitution quietly, maybe we could avoid involving the police. I knew about his family, his reputation in the village. I didn't want to destroy him if it could be avoided. Miss Marple studied Harold's earnest face, recognising the fundamental decency that had motivated his actions. So you went to the dairy that night? I got there early and waited outside. I could see Turner working late, just as he said he would be in his reply to my note. But then I heard the separator start up, running much faster than normal. There was a terrible grinding sound, like machinery coming apart. Harold paused, reliving the traumatic memory. I was about to go in when I heard this awful crash, and then silence. I waited for what seemed like hours, but Turner never came out. Finally, I crept close enough to look through the window. And you saw Turner's body? I saw him lying by the separator and all that cream everywhere. The paddle was right there beside him, the same one he'd used on me. I knew how it would look if anyone found me there, especially with this bandage on my head and Turner dead from a blow with that paddle. Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. Harold, did you see anyone else at the dairy that night? Anyone who might have tampered with the separator? Harold shook his head slowly. The place seemed deserted when I arrived, but I wasn't watching continuously. Someone could have been there earlier, or come and gone while I was hiding. Miss Marple had been listening with growing understanding. Harold, you said the separator was running faster than normal. In your experience with dairy equipment, what would cause such a malfunction? Only one thing, Harold replied immediately. Someone would have had to loosen the cover bolts while the machine was running. Dangerous work, that. You'd need to know exactly what you were doing, or you'd get caught by the escaping pressure. And you're certain Turner was alone when this happened? As far as I could tell, though I suppose someone could have sabotaged the machine earlier and waited for Turner to activate it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The picture was becoming clearer, though several pieces of the puzzle remained elusive. Turner had been lured to work late that night, presumably by Harold's note, but someone else had prepared the separator to fail catastrophically. The question was who had possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to carry out such a plan. Harold, she said gently, I think it's time you came back to the village. Inspector Slack has arrested Tom Perry for tampering with the separator on Turner's orders, but there are still questions that need answering. Harold looked up with surprise. Tom Perry? But he's just a boy. Why would he... Turner was blackmailing him, threatening to implicate Tom's mother in the fraud. Tom loosened those bolts thinking he was helping Turner stage a minor accident to distract from the missing money. But it went wrong, Harold said with growing understanding. Turner slipped on the spilled cream and fell right into the path of that paddle. Miss Marple considered this explanation, but something about it still troubled her. The positioning of the paddle, the timing of Turner's fall, the precision with which the separator had been sabotaged. It all seemed too convenient to be entirely accidental. Perhaps, she said carefully, but I suspect there's more to this story than we yet understand. As they helped Harold to his feet and prepared to escort him back to the village, Miss Marple reflected on the complex chain of events that had led to this tragedy. Turner's greed, Harold's honesty, Tom's fear, and now a death that might or might not have been the accident it appeared to be. But she had learned long ago that in matters of murder, coincidences were rarely as coincidental as they seemed. Chapter 10. Revelation over warm milk. The village hall of St. Mary Mead had not seen such a gathering in recent memory. Word of Harold Briggs's recovery and Tom Perry's arrest had spread swiftly through the community, and by Friday evening virtually every resident had assembled to hear Inspector Slack's official account of the case. Miss Marple sat in the front row, her knitting bag at her feet and a thoughtful expression on her face. Beside her, Harold Briggs looked considerably better after a night's rest and Dr. Haydock's attention to his injuries. Edna Briggs clutched her husband's good arm, her relief evident in every line of her bearing. Inspector Slack stood at the small podium, his notebook open before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began formally, I can now provide you with a complete account of the tragic events at Turner's Modern Dairy." He proceeded to outline the case methodically. Turner's systematic fraud, Harold's discovery of the embezzlement, the confrontation in the cream shed, and Tom Perry's reluctant participation in sabotaging the separator. The evidence clearly shows, Inspector Slack concluded, that Oswald Turner's death was the unintended result of his own scheme to stage an accident and destroy evidence of his fraudulent practices. Young Tom Perry, acting under coercion and threats against his mother, loosened the separator bolts as instructed. When Turner activated the machine, the resulting explosion of pressurized cream created the dangerous conditions that led to his fatal fall. The assembled villagers murmured among themselves, but Miss Marple remained silent, her fingers working steadily at her knitting. When Inspector Slack called for questions, she rose quietly from her seat. "Inspector, if I may," she said in her gentle voice, "there are one or two small points that still puzzle me." Inspector Slack's expression suggested he would have preferred to conclude the matter without further complications, but he nodded politely. "Certainly, Miss Marple." "Well, it's probably nothing of importance, but I've been wondering about the timing of events that night. According to Tom Perry's statement, he loosened the separator bolts early Tuesday evening, before Turner sent him home, yet Turner didn't activate the machine until nearly midnight." "What's your point?" Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "Simply that in my limited experience with such equipment, I helped my nephew Raymond with his small dairy operation years ago. Separator bolts under pressure would begin to work loose gradually once disturbed. It seems unlikely they would remain stable for several hours." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with interest. "Miss Marple raises a valid point. The metallurgy involved would suggest those bolts should have failed much sooner if they were significantly loosened." Inspector Slack consulted his notes with evident irritation. Perhaps Perry's sabotage was more subtle than he admitted, just enough to ensure eventual failure. "Possibly," Miss Marple agreed, "but there's another small detail that troubles me. Harold, when you observed the separator that night, you mentioned it was running faster than normal. Could you elaborate on that?" Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, it was making more noise than usual, and the vibration seemed excessive, almost as though someone had adjusted the speed controls." "How interesting! And such adjustments would require someone familiar with the equipment's operation." "Absolutely. The controls are quite complex, not something an amateur would attempt." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Which brings me to my most puzzling observation. Tom, dear, you mentioned that Mr. Turner specifically told you to stay away from the dairy that evening. Did he give any reason for this instruction?" Tom Perry, who had been released on bail pending trial, looked up with obvious discomfort. "He said he had important work to finish and didn't want any interruptions." Yet according to the evidence we found, Turner was actually preparing to make restitution for his fraud. The calculations in his notebook suggest he was planning to repay the stolen money. Hardly the actions of a man planning to destroy evidence. Inspector Slack frowned. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting that Turner's death was not the result of his own scheme, but rather the culmination of someone else's plan. Someone who knew about the midnight meeting between Turner and Harold, who understood the separator equipment intimately, and who had access to the dairy after Tom had supposedly sabotaged it." The hall had grown very quiet, with all eyes focused on Miss Marple as she continued her reasoning. "Consider the evidence carefully. The separator bolts were marked with blue chalk, Tom's chalk that had mysteriously disappeared. But Tom freely admits he was coerced into loosening the bolts earlier that evening. Why would he then need to mark them with his own chalk? It makes no sense." Tom's face had gone pale. "I never marked those bolts with chalk. I just loosened them like Turner told me to do." "Exactly. Someone else marked those bolts, wanting to ensure Tom would be implicated in the sabotage. Someone who had taken Tom's chalk for precisely that purpose." Miss Marple turned to address the assembled villagers directly. The real killer knew that Turner and Harold were meeting that night. They retightened the separator bolts after Tom had left, then carefully loosened them again just before Turner's arrival, marking them with Tom's stolen chalk to ensure he would be blamed. "But who?" Inspector Slack demanded. Who else had access to the dairy and knowledge of the equipment? Miss Marple's eyes swept the crowd until they settled on a figure near the back of the hall. Someone who had been helping with the dairy's bookkeeping for months. Someone who knew about Turner's fraud but was powerless to stop it without implicating her own son. Someone who saw an opportunity to eliminate Turner and frame Tom for an accident, believing that a charge of negligent sabotage would be preferable to a charge of murder. Mrs. Perry rose slowly from her seat, her face ashen but her bearing dignified. "You're very clever, Miss Marple. Too clever for an old woman's peace of mind." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs, but Mrs. Perry continued speaking, her voice carrying clearly above the noise. "I discovered Oswald's fraud weeks ago when I was doing his books. I knew he was stealing from decent people, and I knew he was using my boy's position to cover his tracks. When Tom came home Tuesday night, terrified about what Turner had made him do, I realised this was my chance to end it." "So you went to the dairy after Turner sent Tom home," Miss Marple said gently. "I watched from across the street until I saw Tom leave. Then I used the key Turner had given me for bookkeeping purposes. I fixed what Tom had done to the separator, then waited until nearly midnight to sabotage it properly. I knew Turner would activate it when Harold arrived for their meeting." Mrs. Perry's confession continued in measured tones. "I loosened the bolts just enough to create a catastrophic failure, marked them with Tom's chalk to make it look like his sabotage had worked, and adjusted the speed controls to ensure maximum pressure. When Turner started the machine, the result was exactly what I intended." Inspector Slack moved toward Mrs. Perry, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not running, Inspector. I'm tired of secrets and lies. My only regret is that I had to let Tom believe he was responsible for Turner's death. But I couldn't let that man destroy more lives with his greed." As Mrs. Perry was taken into custody, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of family loyalty and desperate protection that had led to this tragedy. A mother's love for her son had driven her to murder, yet that same love had prevented her from sparing him the guilt she had intended him to bear. Later, as the village hall emptied and the residents of St. Mary Mead returned to their homes, Miss Marple joined Harold and Edna Briggs for a quiet cup of tea at their cottage. "It's all so sad," Edna murmured, warming milk at the stove. "Mrs. Perry was just trying to protect Tom." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I fear her protection may have done him more harm than Turner's coercion ever could have." Harold, his head properly bandaged and his arm in a sling, looked up from his chair by the fire. "What will happen to the dairy now?" "The village cooperative will take it over," Miss Marple replied. "And I understand they're planning to offer you the position of manager, given your intimate knowledge of the routes and customers." "And the bottles?" Edna asked. "Harold's message bottles?" Miss Marple smiled. "I believe they'll make excellent conversation pieces for the new dairy's office, a reminder that truth, like cream, will always rise to the surface, provided one keeps the stirrer out of mischief." As she sipped her warm milk and watched the flames dance in the grate, Miss Marple contemplated the curious human capacity for both great kindness and terrible deception. In the end, it was love that had driven Mrs. Perry to murder, just as it was love that had motivated Harold's careful preservation of evidence. The village would heal, as villages always did, but the lessons learned would linger long after the last echoes of this strange affair had faded into memory.